Welcome to Stalin's War, a conversation on the new history of World War II with Dr. Sean McMeekin. I'm Chelsea Mikta, a research fellow at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, and I'm so pleased to be joined today by Sean McMeekin, a member of the Academic Council here at DOC. Sean is the Francis Flournoy Professor of European History and Culture at Bard College. He holds a BA from Stanford University and an MA and PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. His previous books include The Russian Revolution, A New History, The Ottoman Endgame, War, Revolution, and the Making of the Modern Middle East, which won the Arthur Goodside Book Prize, The Russian Origins of the First World War, which won the Norman B. Tomlinson Jr. Book Prize and was nominated for the Liner Gelber Book Prize, The Berlin to Baghdad Express, The Ottoman Empire and Germany's Bid for World Power, which won the Barbara Jelavich Book Prize, History's Greatest Heist, The Looting of Russia by the Bolsheviks, and numerous other books, articles, and book chapters. During today's conversation, Sean will discuss his latest book, a bold revisionist work entitled Stalin's War, A New History of World War II, which draws on ambitious new research in Soviet, European, and US archives, and challenges us to reframe our understanding of this global conflict by moving its epicenter to the east. Just a quick note on the run of the show. Following his presentation, Sean and I will have a brief conversation and then turn to questions submitted by the audience. You can submit questions for Sean throughout the presentation using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Sean, welcome. I know our audience is eager to learn more about your book, so I invite you to share your presentation.
Thank you, Chelsea, for that kind introduction. I hope you can all see me. It's always a little bit confusing here in the Zoom. First, I'll just show the book as a kind of show and tell, and then explain a little bit about where the book came from. Like most of my works, I think the ultimate inspiration came from the opening of the Russian archives, particularly the Soviet archives, but also to some extent the Tsarist Russian archives in 1991 following the collapse of the Soviet Union. I just happened to be in my, I guess first junior, then senior year in high school when all this was transpiring. I grew up against the backdrop of all of the drama involving Glasnost, Perestroika, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the following summer, I was actually doing an NEH research project on the Eastern Front in the Second World War when the Library of Congress put on an exhibition on the revelations from the Russian archives. And ever since, I've been exploiting to one extent or another, to the extent it's been possible, those archives, many of them, many different archives inside Russia. And all along, I've simply been fascinated by the idea that a lot of history had been hidden to us. So I've done this in a number of books, but interestingly, I had not actually gotten back to the Second World War, which is kind of my first love, what first really got me turned on to history back in high school with a couple of brilliant teachers that I had. But I'd always been meaning to come back, and about 5 years ago, after completing a whole series of works that had more to do with the First World War and the Russian Revolution, I decided to dive in. Now, I came to the table with a couple of questions in mind. I expected that I would learn something new. I hoped that I would learn something new from not just the archives themselves, but from some of the volumes which have been published. Dozens of volumes have been coming out since the 1990s. This is something really only a lot of specialists tend to know, in part because I think it takes a while for new archival knowledge and research to really filter down or percolate down into the more general understanding of what you'll see in the general works on the war. Huge revelatory volumes were published all through the 1990s and really on into the early Putin years. It started kind of petering out around 2006, 2008, as I think the new kind of ossification to some extent of historical understanding under the Putin regime was beginning, where people began to clamp down again a little bit on the archives. But fortunately for us, a lot of the documents had already been published. Some of them are still available, some of them are a little less available than they were before. But I came to the table with a couple of questions in mind. One of which had to do with Soviet foreign policy in the 1930s and what we might call the origins of the war, that is the backstory of what we now refer to as the Second World War, to some extent in Asia, but more specifically in Europe. Again, with the traditional story with the narrative of Hitler coming to power in 1933, Hitler remilitarizing the Rhineland, that is invading the Rhineland, 1936, the Anschluss 38, Munich Conference, Sudetenland, later in 1938, and then and finally the move into Prague, the carve up of the rest of Czechoslovakia, with Slovakia breaking off, Hungary seizing territory, Poland seizing territory. The traditional story, it's all about Hitler, that is to say. And if there's any role at all for the Soviets in the story, it's this kind of lament that because of the anti-communist prejudice, you might call it, in the Western capitals, or maybe because they didn't think the Red Army was serious because of the army purges, they refused to trust or to work with Stalin. The failure of collective security. That is, the failure, mostly, it tends in a lot of the literature to get blamed on the West, that the West didn't take Hitler seriously enough. They didn't trust Stalin. They didn't work together with Stalin because of, again, this political prejudice about communism. There was always something a bit strange about that story to me. First of all, the idea that the Soviet Union believed in collective security and the rule of law in the period, of course, which coincided with the Great Terror, with galloping xenophobia at home, with the purges being extended to Europe in the form of the Spanish Civil War, with these extraterritorial executions being carried out as the terror was expanded to places like Switzerland, later even Mexico and the United States, that the problem was that the West refused to trust Stalin. It's a little bit strange to me. When I dug a little further, some of the story actually is obvious. It's just usually ignored. Stalin actually wrote a humongous book about communism in 1938, usually called The Short Course, this kind of Bible of international communism. And he doesn't talk about collective security in the book. It nowhere appears. He talks about the Second Imperialist War. There's a whole different way that Stalin viewed the world. It's true that the Commissar for Foreign Affairs for much of this period, Litvinov, partly because he was Jewish and he was abused by the Nazis and anti-Semitic screeds. He was a kind of, you might call it, a good face, a good public face for the idea that the Soviets actually did have some notion of collective security. But in fact, as I discovered, it was actually another historian called Richard Rock who first talked about this. Litvinov was actually demoted from the European desk as early as 1937. He really was just a front man. Stalin's own policy had nothing to do with collective security. Stalin himself had no interest in collective security. This is pure projection on the part of some of these historians, that they assume that Stalin viewed the world in the same way that they did. In fact, Stalin had not a rigid, but certainly a fairly firm worldview, which was rooted in Marxism, Leninism, where you did have these hostile blocs. There was enough suppleness to it where he saw the capitalist world being split into hostile blocs. He knew his history, like all Marxists did. He knew about the First World War. And to a large extent, what he was hoping and planning for was that there would be a new European war pitting Germany and possibly her other allies, such as Mussolini's Italy, against the Western powers. And this was not something that Stalin feared. Rather, he hoped it would happen. This is precisely what he wanted to happen, so that eventually the Soviets could take advantage. The Soviets had territorial aims, which were no less revisionist than those of the so-called Axis powers, Italy, Germany, and Japan. Those revisionist aims, some of them just grew out of the settlements after the end of the First World War, with Soviet Russia losing territory to Poland. Also in the war with Poland in 1920, losing territory to Romania, losing territory to the newly independent Baltic states, also territory to Finland. If you actually look into the archives of the Soviet diplomatic service, the Commissariat of Foreign Affairs, it's replete with all kinds of talk about these imperialist aims. You know, they're totting things up in terms of the number of proletarians, as they call them, that should be under Soviet rule. Stalin was very much a revisionist. He was just a little bit more artful at camouflaging it. And he also got a better press in the West, in part because of communist influence, and I think just in part because of the myopia and blindness of the West that really didn't understand what he was up to. So that when Britain and France famously send these envoys on this slow-moving seagoing vessel, the city of Exeter, it's true they didn't actually fly to Moscow in August 1939. To some extent, yes, this represented a little bit of a not entire confidence or good faith on the part of Britain. France's envoy actually did have full plenipotentiary powers to negotiate. Britain's did not. Stalin, it's often said, didn't take them seriously. He didn't think they took him seriously. In fact, Stalin had already been negotiating through back channels with the Germans for months, and they were pretty close to terms. They had already started haggling over things like the Baltic states and spheres of influence, and whether Stalin would get his preferred slice of Romania under what they called Southeastern questions, etc. They'd already been talking about this through back channels for months. And we now actually have access to some of the transcripts, so we know what Stalin was even thinking and saying at the time, that he was quite clear that if he did cut some sort of a deal with France and Britain, that Hitler's hand might be stayed short of invading Poland. There was always a problem with the idea that the Soviets would actually help out a country like Czechoslovakia in 1938 or Poland in 1939. So I'm actually just briefly going to do a screen share here, if I can pull out the right map. This is a very basic map of Europe. Make sure we're seeing the right map here. A very basic map of Europe in 1936. It's shortly before the territorial adjustments of 1938, so it's not fully up to date in 1939. But you see, first of all, the problem with the idea that the Soviets had any interest in saving Czechoslovakia is, of course, that they didn't share a border with Czechoslovakia. They would have had to actually invade Poland or Romania first. Amazingly, when the French and British envoys came to Moscow in August 1939, that's basically what Stalin said. He said, look, if you want us to do anything, no, not Stalin, this is Voroshilov speaking for Stalin, this kind of his hack from the Defense Commissariat, who says, well, look, we need permission to invade Poland and Romania. Have you obtained this permission for us? Well, of course they hadn't obtained permission. The French were game enough to ask, and of course the Poles said, no, we do not actually want the Soviet Union, our mortal enemy going back to 1920, to invade our country. It was never really a serious prospect that Poland would have accepted this. So there was always a little bit of bad faith, certainly from the Soviet side, in the idea that the Soviets actually had much of a serious interest in collective security. So when push came to shove, as we know, Stalin and Hitler cut this deal. We usually call it the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And it's not that it's a secret that they cut this deal, but I think the parts that are still relatively little understood in the West and have not really been discussed adequately, I don't think, by historians, are first of all, the grasping nature of the Soviet claims. The Soviets actually demanded a larger slice of Polish territory than the German. They were given it. In addition to this, the Soviets, of course, demanded these other spheres of influence in places like the Baltic states and Romania. The other part I think that's still not generally understood is that the Germans were actually expecting the Soviets to invade Poland, if not precisely in simultaneous unison with the German invasion, then shortly thereafter. Because if you actually do look at the map, I'm going to try to show, perhaps here, if I share this one, once again, I think the other map is on the same document here. I'm going to switch to the Polish boundaries map. I hope you can see the Polish boundaries map. There were a couple of problems here. The Germans, in the end, they actually overstepped the demarcation lines quite dramatically. Initially, the armies were supposed to meet up somewhere in central Poland in the vicinity of Warsaw, as you can see here. This is actually the Molotov-Ribbentrop line. The Soviets never got anywhere close to that because they actually waited 16 days before invading Poland from the east. And when they did that, they had this clever tack of effectively pretending that they were not actually invading Poland. They actually asked the Germans. The Germans were quite frustrated. Why aren't you invading? Why are you pretending that you're not agreeing with us and allied to us? Why are you pretending that you're neutral, which was the Soviet posture? And that was Stalin's posture. Stalin wanted a war to break out between Germany and the Western powers. He wanted to be neutral. That way, of course, they wouldn't declare war on him, and meanwhile, he could seize whatever territory that he wanted in the slipstream of Hitler's victories. Well, as it turned out, what the Soviets wanted was for Warsaw to surrender so that Poland would cease to exist, so the Soviets could then pretend that they weren't actually invading. It was a protection mission, and that's the way they described it. Now, they got an erroneous report that Warsaw had fallen on the 16th, and that's why they invaded on the 17th. Warsaw actually kept resisting quite bravely and heroically for another 10 or so days afterwards. But meanwhile, the Soviets had at least their pretext. So they call in the Polish ambassador. They say, basically, your country no longer exists, and so we're arresting you. Your diplomatic immunity has expired. Now, meanwhile, the Soviet invasion is kind of the critical moment because Poland had tried to keep resisting until then. The government had evacuated Warsaw and had tried to actually flee down effectively to the southeast, the only direction from which the Germans in their five-pronged invasion had not actually invaded the country. And when the Soviets invade, this cuts off the escape route. Quite literally, they actually have to flee to Romania. They don't even secure permission to retain any sovereign authority. They're forced to sign this humiliating agreement. For the next couple of years, among other things, Hitler and Stalin are actually engaged in this interesting sort of a shadow war where they're trying to track down as many renegade Poles as possible, although Stalin pursued it with far more vigor, as we know, particularly in the so-called Katyn massacre, where he had nearly 23,000 Poles, including 15,000 military officers executed in the spring of 1940. This is another thing I discovered, incidentally. Again, it's not that the Katyn massacre is unknown, although it was officially denied by the Soviets for the entirety of the Cold War. And these days in Russia, there are a lot of books which are starting to deny it once again, although there was an official acknowledgement after the fall of communism in '91 of responsibility. A lot of books have come out about, but very few of them actually explain why Stalin carried out this massacre when he did. So this is yet another kind of an interesting thing that I discovered in the case of what the archives actually show. Although I do have to give some credit to Nikolai Tolstoy, who actually guessed at this story back in the early 1980s, despite having no access to the relevant archives. It's truly amazing the way he did this. I'm just going to share a screen right here. I'm going to share a couple of screens, very briefly, an invasion map involving the Soviet invasion of Finland, shortly in the wake of a kind of half-hearted occupation of the Baltic states, which Stalin carried out in October. It wasn't the full occupation, which would come the following June. This is actually, I'm not sure if you're seeing the correct map here. I'm trying to show the Polish invasion map. I'm just going to stop the screen share for now because I'm not sure which map is actually being shown. But so push comes to shove, when the Finns, unlike the three Baltic countries, resisted Stalin's demands, this is in November 1939, these very aggressive demands for basing rights, including the Hanko Peninsula, which was actually to the other side of Helsinki, along with territory along the Karelian Isthmus, very strategic territory guarding the approaches to Viborg, and also to Helsinki, the Finnish capital. The Finns refuse, as we know, and the Soviets then carry out this absolutely brutal invasion of Finland. And for a while in the winter of 1939-1940, it's funny that a few of the early critics of my book have said I've tried to make too much of the Finnish War, which really was, after all, just a sideshow. In fact, it was not a sideshow at the time. It was the main event. After Poland had been destroyed and dismembered, as we know, the phony war occurs in the West, and effectively the Western allies aren't doing much, and Hitler's not doing much other than thinking and planning what they might do in the spring. The world's attention is actually focused on Finland, and in fact, even the United States, despite the Roosevelt administration's relatively friendly attitude vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, going back to recognition in 1933, a kind of friendly purge of the State Department conducted in 1937 when some of the so-called Russia hands, who tended to be more wary of communism, had been purged. Now, even Roosevelt's blood was up. Even Roosevelt denounces this invasion of an infinitesimally tiny country which could pose no conceivable threat to the Soviet Union. The world is up in arms. The Soviets are even expelled from the League of Nations, as the League secretary rather caustically observed. Germany, Italy, and Japan at least had the decency to resign from the League before committing acts of armed aggression. The Soviets had not. They had to be expelled. So the world's attention is focused on Finland. There's even a lot of discussion in the Allied capitals in the Anglo-French Supreme Command of whether not just aiding Finland, but even possibly of sending troops to Finland in the far north. I'm actually going to make sure that I could pull up the correct map here. So I think what I need to do is first find the correct map so that it shows up, and now I'm going to do the screen share. I think this will actually work better than the other way around. So I'm going to try to do a quick share screen so I can show you the Finnish War map. What mattered the most here was Petsamo in the far north, which, as you can see, is not that far from Norway and Narvik, where the British did eventually try to land, although, of course, they ended up having to race the Germans into these ports. This whole saga here, where both the Germans and the Western Allies were planning these Scandinavian operations, alarmed Stalin no end, because Stalin saw the prospect of possibly even the hostile Royal Navy coming into the Barents Sea. Petsamo was also nearby. There were nickel deposits, and a lot of nickel was being produced there. The Germans needed it for their panzers, so it was highly strategic. So the Soviets invade, and that was actually the only successful operation. They did actually capture Petsamo, which also alarmed Hitler, even though he was still working together with Stalin at the time. And I'm going to stop this screen share and then show you the other side of the story. What begins to alarm Stalin that winter is not just the prospect that the French and British might land troops in the far north, possibly even in Finland. And there's some talk in the French General Staff, in fact, they even have a couple of dates they're throwing out that are in early March 1940, where the first echelon of troops might be landing there. At the same time, the Allies were also talking about operations. I'm going to pull up one more map here. I'm going to try to get the map in the right place so I can do the correct screen share now. I'm going to try to share a screen now of the Soviet Caucasus. The British had actually begun looking seriously into the possibility of bombing the oil fields of Baku. Now, again, this is a story which is known by specialists. It's not like it's entirely secret, but the way this all fits together, I don't think had been generally perceived until we had access to the Soviet archives. Now, it turns out that Stalin knew about these plans. He knew about the Finnish plans. He had an exceptional intelligence network. He was also paranoid, as we know, so he could even exaggerate and make the threat seem even larger than it was. He had a spy actually with the French command in Damascus, who was actually the key advisor on Caucasian affairs to General Weygand, who was telling him about all of this. So he knew that the French and British were talking about bombing Baku. They actually ended up carrying out surveillance flights at the end of March and also over Batumi in early April. It was in early March that the chatter was peaking. The reason this mattered was that Stalin was confronted with the prospect not only of a hostile intervention against him in Finland. There was talk that Romania and Turkey might join in with their own invasions, whether in the Caucasus or of Ukraine. There was talk the United States might not join the war, but might support it with arms deliveries financially. Countries like Hungary, Italy, and Spain. Volunteers were now pouring into Scandinavia, hoping to join the fight in Finland. On top of all of that, Stalin is now presented with the threat that something like 75% of Soviet oil production might be knocked out. That's the oil production of the Transcaucasus. This was also a threat to Hitler, and this is why the British and French wanted to do it, because about a third of Hitler's oil was actually coming from this region. Now, it's interesting, once again, they were too slow. They never actually did get around to carrying this out because Stalin preempted them. First of all, by signing a quick and peremptory peace with Finland on March 12, 1940. And then, even before that, in fact, on March 5th, we now know he ordered what would become known as the Katyn Forest Massacre, which might seem completely unrelated. And in fact, the murders were not carried out in the Katyn Forest, they were carried out in cities. But Stalin had this preternatural fear and almost loathing of Poles, particularly aristocratic Poles, particularly Polish officers. And he was afraid that there might be this mass uprising inside the Soviet Union if the Allies declared war on him. And there were also Polish pilots training in the RAF who would later participate in the Battle of Britain. There were Poles who were training for expeditionary missions to either Scandinavia or the Caucasus. Now, after first Stalin, then Hitler preempted everyone with his operations in Norway and the Low Countries. Everyone kind of forgot about this. Everyone except for Stalin. The Germans actually captured the files, so that for a while, later in 1940, in fact, after the Germans published, once they invade France, they capture the files, Hitler and Stalin actually started working, if anything, even closer together, except for one area. And this is what I think one of the key discoveries that I made, although a few other historians have, again, tried to kind of guess at this. They haven't actually seen most of the files. The final break between Hitler and Stalin, preparatory or prior to what we now call Operation Barbarossa, occurred over Balkan questions. There was this summit that has long been known about in Berlin in November 1940. This is when Molotov went to meet with Hitler and Ribbentrop, and he also met Rudolf Hess and Himmler and all the other leading Nazis. It turned out that, in fact, the Germans thought the meetings had gone relatively well. They hadn't agreed on everything, but they thought the meetings had been friendly. We now know from Molotov's own real-time telegraphic communications from Stalin that he and Stalin had, in fact, decided to break with Hitler even before the Germans broke with them. Stalin laid down what was, in effect, an ultimatum. Hitler had invited the Soviet Union to join the Tripartite Pact. They had restyled the old anti-Comintern Pact of Italy, Germany, Japan. So it's now going to be restyled. The Soviets are invited to join. Stalin insisted, as a price of joining the Tripartite Pact, that the Germans withdraw all of their troops from Finland and Romania, including military advisors, that Stalin be allowed to invade Bulgaria and to station troops at the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, that is to say, the Turkish Straits. He was afraid of British encroachment again. He still saw the British as the enemy. That's one of the other really fascinating things that you see if you actually read the real correspondence, is that Stalin, before Barbarossa, and even to some extent after it, and towards the end of the war, continued to view the Anglo-Saxons, as he called them, as his enemy. As he told Matsuoka, Japan's foreign minister, in April 1941, and actually in their first meeting in March, he had never viewed the Anglo-Saxons as his friends, and he did not intend to befriend them now. Now, strangely enough, they had been wary of Stalin too. But then when Hitler does make this decision to invade, in part because of, again, this break over the Balkans, in part because of Hitler's own ideology, racial obsessions about Lebensraum and cleansing room for the German settlers in the East, there's a mix of reasons that help to explain why Hitler made the final decision. It's sort of like this act of almost diplomatic magic. There's kind of a public relations miracle. To give you an idea of what I mean, again, even the Roosevelt administration, which had been relatively friendly vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, in the days before Barbarossa, they had been about to expel Soviet spies, including aviation spies and experts who would actually burrow deeply into the US aviation sector, and they were scheduled for deportation. Relations were about to go into a deep freeze. Suddenly, poof, everything vanishes. Stalin is a hero. His peoples, they are heroes. Secretly at first, later after November 1941, openly, Roosevelt opens the spigot of Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union and lavishes vast amounts of war materiel, industrial inputs, foodstuffs, boots, uniforms, you name it. It's all given effectively for free to the Soviet Union. Churchill, too, although Churchill had actually been a little bit friendlier vis-a-vis Stalin than, let's say, the Chamberlain government had been. He had written a lot of letters to Stalin, but Stalin hadn't answered any of them because he was loyal to Hitler. He refused to actually write directly to Churchill until 4 weeks after Barbarossa. Churchill, almost in this kind of feeling of deliverance because Britain had been fighting alone, suddenly it is an ally. Churchill sends off the famous 200 Hawker Hurricane fighters, the pursuit planes which had been destined to defend Singapore against Japan. He then reassigns all of these Lend-Lease warplanes, fighters, tanks, later still a lot of jeeps, trucks, Studebakers, etc., that are all sent to Stalin, even though a lot of them were desperately needed by Britain's own armies in the field. He also decides to send, and this is critical, refined aluminum, or as they call it in Britain, aluminium, which was desperately needed in Britain's own warplane factories, and in fact retarded by a number of years British aircraft production. He decides all this in this kind of almost gallant gesture of sacrifice, because of course he wants the Soviets to be able to stay in the war. And there was some logic to this. In fact, the Soviets, I discovered, were in much more serious trouble in 1941 than anyone thought. There's a vast amount of research on the German side of Barbarossa. There's a lot of new research showing, oh, well, they never had enough trucks, they never had enough this, they never had enough that, they were doomed to fail. Very few people have paid attention to the material side of the ledger on the Soviet side. In fact, the Soviets were running out of everything in 1941. They were running out of tanks. They had to evacuate most of their tank factories, and despite boasts that they evacuated all of them intact to the Urals, in fact, Soviet tank production plummets in 1941. It's running at 4 times the pace of losses. That is to say, they're producing only about 1/4 what they need even to kind of replace their losses. In fighters, it's not quite as dramatic, but in a lot of other sectors, the Soviet production simply collapses in 1941 for the obvious reason that the Germans capture all of the cities and lands where the Soviets are producing all of these things. The Soviets would have been absolutely lost without the Lend-Lease aid, which began arriving in these tremendous quantities in November and December 1941. They would have been lost without being able to transfer troops over from Siberia, as we now know in part because of Stalin's superlative intelligence network, including the famous Richard Sorge, a spy in Tokyo, and some of these spying operations in Washington, where he had a pretty good idea how things were trending between the United States and Japan. Now, amazingly, despite Stalin's massive and famous bellyaching over the next 3 years about his allies' refusal to open up a second front in Europe, Stalin, of course, refuses to open up a second front of any kind against Japan after Pearl Harbor. So loyal is he to Japan that he actually arrests hundreds of US pilots who happened to crash land on Soviet territory after bombing raids on Japan. There were more than 100 of them arrested in the month of December 1943 alone, after the Tehran conference, when supposedly Roosevelt and Stalin had kind of made friends with all this bonhomie. They kept arresting them as prisoners of war. Even more amazingly, over the course of the next 4 years, the United States shipped 8.244 million tons of Lend-Lease aid across the Pacific Ocean through Japanese territorial waters to the Soviet Union. You might think the Japanese would have wanted to molest or stop or curtail those shipments. In fact, no. Japan was perfectly happy that the United States was wasting millions of tons of war material on the loyally neutral Soviet Union instead of sending them to China or using them themselves. All of this, I think, are the arts or the crafts of Stalin's incredibly cunning diplomacy, where he gets away with this. Roosevelt asked him dozens of times, could you maybe help us against Japan? Maybe let a few of our pilots maybe even fly things into Siberia. No, even the warplanes flown across Alaska, they couldn't even make it as far as Nome, according to Stalin's rules. They had to stop in Fairbanks, where the Soviet pilots would come over and take delivery of them, as the term of art had it. So Stalin basically just asked, and Roosevelt gave and gave and he gave. And it's long been known that this happened at a conference such as Yalta, but in fact at Tehran, and we now have the full unexpurgated transcripts, including the Soviet ones at Tehran, to see just how much the United States gave up. I don't want to run through time, but there's so many more questions to open up, and I'm sure some of you might be interested in this. So one of the things I do talk about vis-a-vis the Tehran conference, which has gotten a few people talking, is the brief discussion in the early stages of the conference that the Allies might possibly have had either an alternative to what we call D-Day, that is Overlord, the invasion of northern France, which Stalin was insisting on. Whether it was a realistic prospect, whether it was ever seriously considered. Well, we do know that the British and American military advisors had actually seriously discussed this before Tehran. Churchill famously favored this. This was his so-called Mediterranean, in fact, more literally Adriatic stratagem. Churchill actually remembered the First World War. To some extent, the Germans had to give up the ghost after the breakout from the Salonika beachhead in 1918, in September 1918. He knew his history. He knew all about that. So Churchill favors it. Roosevelt briefly actually goes along with Churchill and proposes this to Stalin, even thinking it'd be cooperative. Maybe if the Allies land troops at Trieste or somewhere else in the Adriatic, they can wheel up through Yugoslavia into Romania, maybe into Hungary. Maybe they could link up, he says, with the Red Army advancing from Odessa. Interestingly, the Red Army hadn't reached Odessa yet. They wouldn't be there for another 5.5 months. At the time, they were actually still about 1,000 kilometers from the old Soviet border. So it's often said, for example, that Roosevelt had to make these concessions to assign Poland and the Baltic states, as he did at Tehran, to Stalin. That's with apologia I discovered. The first is that advance probably wouldn't have been possible at all without the Lend-Lease aid, which, far from slowing down in 1943 to 44, actually ramped up dramatically, just when it was no longer so desperately needed. The Soviets are actually moving forward on American tires and trucks. So I have these pictures in the book towards the end of the war of the Studebakers in Berlin and Bucharest. My own personal favorite picture, I'm first going to kind of pull it up here so that I can do the correct screen share. This is my own personal favorite picture in the book, and I hope it will actually be just a little bit more visible here than in the book where it's in black and white. I'm going to try screen. So here we have Berling, the head of effectively Stalin's sort of puppet army after they do finally move into to Poland in 1944 in the summer. They're going around hunting down Polish patriots, the Home Army fighters, in regifted Harley Davidsons. So yes, Harley Davidsons and Studebakers and Jeeps and Chevrolet trucks they pour into Yugoslavia. All of this, again, that was a part of the equation. I said the other problem with the apologia that is that there was no other choice, that Eastern Europe had to be assigned to Stalin. I think the other problem with this argument is that, in fact, at the time when most of this was being decided at the Tehran conference, again, the Soviets hadn't conquered it yet. They were still blundering about in eastern Belarus and Ukraine, in many places as many as 600 miles from the old Soviet border, which they would not, in fact, reach until summer 1944. One of the things they talked about was, even if they did carry out Overlord, maybe Churchill hoped they could do something in the Adriatic first. They had 500,000 troops in Italy. They had 68 landing craft. Churchill thought they should have at least tried some type of a Balkan initiative. Maybe, and by 1944, he's increasingly desperate. He starts telling Roosevelt more and more explicitly, we're going to lose the Balkans unless we do something. By then, Roosevelt has simply said, no, we're never going to do anything there. We're never going to do anything that might alarm Stalin. They could have done it, in fact. The field was still clear. The Soviets weren't even there yet. It's true they might have risked, and here's the counter argument, the kind of devil's advocate position, is that had they actually stood up for their interests at Tehran, Stalin might have cut a deal with Hitler. And I suppose that's true. We simply won't know. There were back-channel negotiations conducted throughout the war in Scandinavia between Hitler and Stalin, and we may never know the truth about that. We may never know the truth about exactly what was discussed between the Germans and the Soviets. What we do know for sure is that Roosevelt at Tehran, and then after Churchill was kind of badgered into agreeing to it, agreed to rule out any operations in the Mediterranean or the Adriatic or the Balkan area to make sure that absolutely everything was thrown into Overlord. Not everything, though. This is the other thing I discovered. A lot of equipment was actually shortchanged to the Allied forces who were going to operate across the English Channel because it was being sent to Stalin instead. Stalin actually received 90 Marine diesel engines in early 1944, which he wasn't even using. I mean, this amazing stuff comes out of the files. And the US Embassy was aware of this, and they actually complained about it. And yet Roosevelt and his key advisors, in particular Harry Hopkins, they simply said, we're going to ignore this. It doesn't matter that the Russians aren't using them, even though they're more desperately needed by the Western allies. So Stalin got his way, and after D-Day, as we know, Operation Bagration, the great big Belarusian and also Polish offensive, is carried out. They come close to Warsaw. They stand back so that Hitler can slaughter the home army while they're hunting down the home army and their regifted Studebakers and Harley-Davidson motorcycles. And as we know, by early 1945, by the time they get to Yalta, by then it really is too late for Eastern Europe, in the sense that the Soviets have already conquered most, if not all, of these territories. And Churchill's last chance to wake up Roosevelt to the danger happens in Quebec in 1944, and yet, because of, in this case, Morgenthau and his key aide, Harry Dexter White, who we now know was a Soviet agent, what they discussed instead at Quebec was a so-called Morgenthau Plan, this kind of reverse psychological warfare to promise that Germany would be reduced to being an agrarian state after the war, and possible mass starvation and all the rest of it. So instead of talking about what they could do to salvage Yugoslavia or the Balkans, they talked about the Morgenthau Plan, which helped give the Germans extra motivation, of course, to shift their troops to the west, to the Ardennes offensive, what we now call the Battle of the Bulge. I don't really have time for the final conclusion of the Pacific War. I did try to hint at some of what I'm getting at, both with Stalin's cunning diplomacy and the incredible timing of the thing. He nearly lost out in the end, though, when Truman, of course, insisted on both unconditional surrender and dropping the atomic bomb. Stalin nearly didn't get his Asian War of Conquest. He had to bump up the military timetable by 2.5 weeks and make sure that he declared war before Japan's surrender. That was on August 9th. But things actually worked out in Asia in some ways even more perfectly than they had in Europe. In Europe, Hitler had nearly ruined everything by turning on Stalin before the Red Armies were ready in 1941. In Asia, things worked out perfectly. Because of the war of attrition fought by the US, Britain, and China, Japan had already transferred 1 million troops back to the home island before the Red Army invaded North China and Manchuria and the Kuril Islands, and North Korea, of course. That had also been given to Stalin by Roosevelt, the Korean share of influence. That was at Yalta. In addition to this, of course, the Americans had supplied the Red Armies with this 8.244 million tons of war material, including motor fuel and aviation gasoline to the tune of about 1 million tons. So then in the end, the Red Army conquest of Northern Asia and the linking up with Mao, which allowed Stalin to supply Mao's armies in the Civil War, along with, of course, the Soviet occupation of North Korea. All of that was enabled by Lend-Lease aid. A story that I think very few people even really have the faintest inkling of, but which I personally find fascinating. And so I'm going to wrap things up there and turn things back over to Chelsea so that we can hopefully get some questions coming in from the floor after our conversation.
Thank you, Sean, for an incredibly informative and expansive presentation. I want to remind those of you in attendance that you can submit your questions to Sean via the Q&A function, which is located at the bottom of your screen. Before we turn to some of the questions the attendees have already sent in, I wanted to ask Sean a few questions. What would you say is the prevailing interpretation of World War II, and what does it get right and what does it get wrong?
Well, it's a good question. I suppose in some ways it's the big question really about the war. And my book is obviously trying to some extent to correct what I consider a slightly unbalanced view on this subject, that the war essentially is all about Hitler's ambition, Hitler's aggression, German invasion of all these countries, German irredentism, and then the Allied response there too. I do think that the backstory of the war, even just vis-a-vis Germany and the Western powers, is a little more complicated than is usually understood. A lot of people forget that Germany and Poland were actually allies between 1939 and 1934 and 1939, both of them viewing the Soviet Union essentially as threats, and that Britain, by kind of almost throwing a brick into the middle of this situation with the so-called guarantee that Chamberlain gives in March, it really was explosive and I think in a lot of ways misguided. The Poles themselves, and I think there's some tragedy there, they actually thought that Britain and France had pledged to make war on Germany in an immediate active sense. So there was a lot of misunderstanding, I think, in 1939, a lot of elements of tragedy. One of the ways in which I try to sort of problematize, I think, our normal understanding of the way the war breaks out in Europe is by saying that First of all, it was not the war that Hitler himself wanted. That is to say, Hitler would have preferred a free hand, yes, to invade Poland. He certainly didn't want Britain and France to declare war on him. That was not the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario would have been if the Soviets declared war on him too. He had obviously covered his flank. But the point being that had Stalin and the Western Allies come to some sort of agreement, Hitler's hands really would have been tied. And the part I think that's not generally understood is that the war that broke out was the one Stalin wanted. And that's why he signed the deal with Hitler. He's quite explicit about this in what he tells Molotov and later Dimitrov. That he hopes this war will break out. And in the beginning, he sees Germany as the weaker party, so he'll help the Germans, and he thinks later on we'll switch sides, once it looks like, things are basically going the way that we want. It didn't happen exactly the way he wanted, because again, the Germans just won too many victories. They showed too much elan and initiative, and the Western Allies were too inept. But I think that in itself has distorted our understanding of the war. Yes, it was the war Stalin wanted. It didn't go exactly the way he would have liked for it to go, but it certainly was not what Hitler wanted to happen in 1939. And as for the British and French decision to make war, it gets stranger and stranger the closer you look at it. They declare war on behalf of Poland. They scarcely lift a finger to help Poland in September 1939, and effectively do nothing for the next 6 to 7 months. So that whatever they were supposedly fighting for, there was also hypocrisy in the sense that they declared war only on one of the two countries invading Poland. And they never really had a good explanation for that. There was no real legal case. They simply determined amongst themselves that when they had said a European power invading Poland, they happened to mean Germany, that Russia didn't really count as a European power. So I personally think that the story has to be written simply because so much of it is confusing or misunderstood or doesn't make sense, at least in the traditional narrative.
What evidence is there that Stalin had in place serious plans, serious war plans against Hitler's Germany? How compelling is this evidence, and why haven't other historians drawn attention to Stalin's apparent intention to violate Molotov-Ribbentrop and prosecute a war against Hitler?
Well, I mean, how serious were the plans in the sense of were they actually wargaming and were they deploying the materiel which pointed towards offensive intentions? Absolutely. On the other hand, we don't have any sort of smoking gun that Stalin had some date in mind, that he was planning to invade in July or August of 1941. There are some Russian historians who have actually proposed specific, at least, ranges of dates, but they haven't necessarily uncovered a kind of a smoking gun. But as far as why historians haven't necessarily paid attention to this, in the first instance, it's simply because the archives weren't open until 1991. There was this famous book written by the defector, Suvorov, usually the English edition people might have heard of is called Icebreaker, and he kind of over-egged the pudding, and the whole thing was this mastermind plan of Stalin's all along, and a lot of it he had to guess because he didn't have access to the files. Now, in the West, most people thought all of this had just been dismissed, and there were a couple of books, particularly by Gabriel Gorodetsky, a book called, I think it was Grand Delusion it was called, just saying this stuff was all just hocus pocus, there was nothing to it, and that's generally speaking what has been the consensus interpretation of the West. What I don't think most Western historians realize is that not just in Russia, but throughout Eastern Europe, dozens of scholars have been looking into this now for nearly 30 years, and they take it very seriously. And new documents emerge all the time. Related to that is Soviet wargaming, exercises conducted with Stalin and his generals, deployment plans, deployment patterns. One of my own contributions is I looked at the files of the main administration of aerodrome construction under the auspices of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, with these very specific appropriations and also construction, that 80% of the new aerodromes built, of which there were 250 in the first 6 months of 1941, were actually built in the frontier districts abutting the German Reich. And that's where they were also pouring in all of their new tanks and petrol stations. To me, I think actually the most illustrative files, both in terms of what they show and also what they don't show, are what are called the Politburo special files, which have actually been open now for years. You can actually see the discussions in the last days before the Germans invade, where they begin to realize the Germans have the jump on them. And there's this kind of creeping sense of dread, horror, panic, because they're not ready yet. You can actually see, for example, that they realize that the aerodromes and the bases and the tank parks haven't been camouflaged. So they issued these last-minute orders to camouflage them, to build dummy aerodromes and dummy airplanes and dummy tanks. And all those orders, we know, were supposed to be completed by some date in July 5th or 20th or 25th. They obviously weren't ready. They were effectively kind of caught in this in this very awkward mid-mobilization limbo, or we might call it collectively, they were caught with their pants down. They weren't ready, they were exposed. And that's one of the reasons why the Germans had such an early run of things, because all of those new air bases, again, some of them unfinished, all of them uncamouflaged, were right near the frontier, and those airplanes were sitting ducks. So I don't think Hitler himself thought of it as a preemptive war in the sense that he didn't know that Stalin planned to invade, for example, but the war preparations definitely factored into the course of events.
You argue that Britain and the US made a grievous error in backing Stalin so fully and letting him get away with so much. Can you elaborate on Churchill and Roosevelt's respective roles in turning the conflict into Stalin's war? Could they have done anything differently that would have prevented the imposition of communism in the former Eastern Bloc? Could Churchill have come to terms with Hitler in 1940? Should Churchill and Roosevelt have cut back resources to the Soviet Union once the tide of war was turning?
I'll start with Churchill. I mean, I might even go all the way back to Chamberlain, because I talked a little bit about the pre-war decisions, this kind of ill-fated guarantee to Poland. I mean, once the war was on, it would have been very hard for Churchill to come up with something kind of a face-saving agreement, in part because Britain just never won any battles. I certainly think that, let's say, after the invasion of France in the Low Countries, there was almost no prospect for peace. There might have been in November 1939, when there was kind of a speech to the Reichstag. Poland had been lost, but at least some sort of compromise maybe could have been arranged then, but that would have required some real sacrifice of both kind of honor and principle on the part of Britain and France. And I think a lot of the public would have maybe refused to go along with it. Certainly Churchill never would have supported that. I mean, just because of his own views, he was very principled about, he might have considered it once or twice, but he definitely was not someone who believed that any kind of a real settlement with Hitler would be possible. As far as Churchill's decisions after Barbarossa, he didn't have to be quite so impulsive, again, with kind of sacrificing Singapore and imperial defenses. And later in 1942, they ship all these tanks from Egypt Command basically up through the Middle East to the Soviet Union before Stalingrad. He didn't have to do that. He didn't have to send all the aluminum. I mean, he really owed Stalin nothing. Stalin had literally been fueling the Luftwaffe and had been bombing London in the Battle of Britain. So he didn't really owe Stalin anything. Churchill did, however, later change his mind at least somewhat. By 1943, the British are no longer sending processed aluminum. The British, they're still going along with whatever the Americans want, but it's pretty clear it's under duress. Churchill does put up some fight at Tehran vis-a-vis some of these territorial decisions and concessions, the planning for the Adriatic stratagem as late as Quebec, I think, as I was talking about, that he tried to get Roosevelt to wake up to the mounting Soviet threat. He put up more of a defense of Poland at Yalta, certainly, than Roosevelt did. And as for Roosevelt, I certainly think he could have acted and behaved differently. I mean, to begin with, when Barbarossa happens, when the Germans invade the Soviet Union, the United States was neutral in the war. And there was absolutely no majority support, whether in Congress and the public at large, for a program of all-out aid to the Soviet Union. His own people went around and canvassed opinion, and they determined only about 11 out of 48 states did the majority support this policy, which is why they kept it secret, and everyone was under instructions to hush it up the first 6 months. There weren't just the so-called isolationists, particularly in the Midwest, but even someone like Harry Truman, the future president. He actually said on the floor of the Senate, well, look, if it looks like Germany's winning, we should help Russia. If it looks like Russia's winning, we should help Germany. Almost the inverse of what Stalin himself had said back in September 1939 vis-a-vis the capitalist powers. So there was no groundswell of support, nor was, for example, unconditional surrender, Roosevelt's most famous contribution to kind of doctrine and war aims. There was no groundswell of public support behind that. There were a lot of people who thought the idea was reckless and counterproductive, and he really came up with the idea mostly, if you look at the sequencing of it, to please Stalin. He was going to send Marshall to Moscow in order to give this as sort of almost a diplomatic surprise gift to Stalin. Stalin ruined the surprise by saying, no, I don't know why Marshall's coming here. I don't see the point. So he never got to actually give the gift, which is why he had to shout it out loud at Casablanca. Now, all those Lend-Lease decisions, again, almost any one of them could have been stopped. It's simply amazing that it goes from before June 1941, the Soviets have to buy things in the United States and spy. After June 1941, they're sent as aid. By 1942, it's called requisitions. They literally give them requisition forms. Soviet purchasing agents, who some of them previously had been spies, now they're operating perfectly legal. They literally got to requisition whatever they wanted from US war factories. The same forms used by the US Armed Forces. They were A1 priority in the queue. Most of those orders were actually fulfilled in terms of the paperwork inside of 48 hours. The Soviets had carte blanche to basically vacuum up whatever they wanted from the US war economy. Now, obviously, that did not have to be agreed to. And that was largely the doing of Harry Hopkins, who figures prominently in the book.
Before I turn to questions from the audience, I wanted to ask a final question about historiography. What are the primary forces that have shaped the historiography of World War II? Was it the dominant geopolitical position of the Soviet Union in the decades following the conflict? Was the scholarly consensus, did it reflect political proclivities within the academy, where there was a desire to not engage in a kind of cold warrior interpretation that would have emphasized Stalin's ruthlessness? What do you attribute this kind of prevailing interpretation to?
Well, I think some of it is simply that history is written by the victors. And so the three victorious powers, they got to draw up the institutions to dominate the UN Security Council and to some extent to dominate the historiography of the war. And the Soviets had, of course, a very highly kind of polished and perfumed version of their war. And because they didn't share any access to the sources, Western historians had to rely on it to the extent they could rely on anything. I think some of what has to do with the historiography of both of the world wars really is also that because Germany lay prostrate in 1945, there were no more secrets. Although a lot of files had been destroyed by bombing, there were no restrictions. Nothing was classified. So people could go in and write whatever they wanted about Hitler and his war aims almost without restriction. We simply didn't know that much about Stalin's war aims. And in fact, in some ways, we knew more in the late 40s when there were still more interesting document volumes coming out. I think what always happens with history is that it gets grooved into these familiar patterns. And especially after the 60s, once the story of the Holocaust came to be more and more dominant in our understanding of the war, it came to be seen as kind of this unblemished good war. It was a triumph of good against evil. And anything that problematized that, let's say, yes, it was great that the Allies brought an end to this evil regime. It was great that obviously the Holocaust was brought to an end mercifully. However, the fate of all those peoples behind the Iron Curtains just kind of got airbrushed out of the story. It problematized the narrative. It made it a little bit more uncomfortable. If the war was about liberation, why, for example, was Poland under Soviet domination and a hostile military occupation? Why has Poland to this day never received a penny of reparations from either Germany or Russia? They applied as recently as 2017 to the Germans. They were rejected, as they always are, on the grounds that they had supposedly waived their rights in 1953 when they were an occupied Soviet satellite state. So a lot of that stuff just got airbrushed out, I think, of the story. And it's probably because the good and evil, the good war story, and it's more edifying. I think it's, it's better for novels, better for Hollywood. It's more reassuring. It's an easier one to kind of put into the school textbooks. It's simple black and white. And sometimes that's the way people like to be told their history.
I have a question about Stalin's apparent refusal to credit intelligence that was pointing to a German invasion and this sort of story of his mental collapse following that invasion. Could you talk a little bit about that interpretation or the narrative around the invasion of the Soviet Union?
Well, sure. I mean, first of all, as everyone knows, all kinds of warnings were pouring in. I mean, the U.S. military attaché, Churchill is sharing even some Enigma intercept information about German deployment. Stalin has his own sources in Tokyo and Berlin, all over the place. It's not that he didn't have warnings. He obviously did. Some of them, yes, he discounted. He said, Richard Sorge, I don't want to listen to him anymore. Ramsay, that was his code name. Partly because there was just so much of it. I mean, I think he probably thought some of it was disinformation. Like some had said the invasion would happen on June 15th. June 15th comes and goes, doesn't happen. However, by the last couple of days, I mean, the information is getting just too massive to ignore, and even some defectors are pouring across the lines. But the idea that he completely ignored these warnings is simply untrue. The night of the 21st, that is hours before the actual invasion proceeds, he did actually order the troops to full combat readiness. We know this now. We have the files. It's true, he didn't authorize them to engage yet. It was a little bit ambiguous. Full combat readiness, but fire only when fired upon. Yes, okay, there's a bit of ambiguity there. But as soon as the invasion came in and was confirmed, he issued a second order, Directive Number 2, it was called, which obviously destroyed the enemy forces. It was not really that ambiguous. We also have the logs, of the kind of the Kremlin logbook. So we know, for example, that he worked almost all through the day on the 22nd. The next 5 or 6 days. He's there regularly. There are a couple of pauses for rest. He doesn't go back to his dacha until a week after the invasion. And I think that was the scene that gave birth to the legend. There's kind of a tirade, and he says something like, oh, well, we flushed Lenin's legacy down the toilet, or some such translation of his remarks, which were probably a little bit off color. And yes, he goes and pouts in his dacha for a few hours. But he didn't disappear for weeks on end. It's true he didn't address the country the first day, and that also kind of gave rise to some of these rumors, and the Germans even played them up in their own propaganda, calling Stalin as a coward hiding in the Kremlin. But no, I think the reason that the legend took hold is probably because it did kind of serve a certain purpose. Khrushchev in particular, he kind of embellished this in the secret speech of 56 to try to turn Stalin into this coward when he was denouncing him. And later on, even as Stalin was rehabilitated in the Brezhnev era, it still served purposes because the idea was it was this completely unprovoked bolt from the blue, completely unexpected, shocking betrayal by Hitler. Whereas in fact, of course, both sides have been arming for months, and you've got all kinds of things going on with the sentries and the spies, and they're both doing overflights. It wasn't really a great mystery. It's just no one knew exactly when the war would start until it started.
Could you talk a little bit more about the role of agents of Soviet influence in the US and Britain in stoking a kind of Stalinophilia, as you put it in the book, in those countries?
Yeah. Well, there were a lot of them. I mean, first of all, not just in London, but also in Cairo. And it was the agents in Cairo, and particularly one called Klugman, who kind of poisoned the well against Mihailovich and the Chetniks, for example, in Yugoslavia, along with an agent at the BBC. So they also had kind of favorable coverage. In Washington, there certainly was some influence in the press. The famous Washington merry-go-round column. There were at least 3 or 4 people who were advising the columnists, we now know, who were reporting in one way or another to the Soviets. The Treasury Department, we know, was honeycombed with spies, Harry Dexter White being only the most famous. Several of them would later end up their careers working for Mao in China. The State Department, we now know, there were a lot of agents. I think that Harry Hopkins, in some ways, is a more interesting figure to me if you talk about agents of influence, in that he doesn't appear to have been either a party member. He doesn't seem to have had a handler that we know of in the NKVD in the way that Harry Dexter White, at least we know who he met with. In some ways, he was so high level that was kind of unnecessary. He simply believed in the cause. And again, we don't know entirely why. I mean, he wasn't a communist. He didn't join the party, but he was quite explicit throughout the war, both in public and in private, that his job was to support the Soviet cause. That he wanted to basically give the Soviets whatever they wanted with no questions asked and no quid pro quo demanded, even when people from the embassy in Moscow, people later on like Avril Harriman, the ambassador, under him, people like Chip Bolin and George Kennan, they would complain about this and say, can't we put some conditions on it? Maybe they can at least let us know how they're using the stuff we're sending them. No, absolutely not. Can we apply political conditions? No, absolutely not. So in the end, those spies and kind of the ones reported the so-called assets, they're significant, but I think in the end, the really critical decisions made by Churchill and Roosevelt, I think some of them were made just because of their own, in the case of Roosevelt, maybe a kind of noblesse oblige. I mean, he saw Stalin and the Soviets as a kind of plucky underdog. In the case of Hopkins, I think it was just this fervent commitment to the Soviet cause, which remains somewhat mysterious. There's no real explanation as to where it came from, but it's clear in the documents. The Harry Hopkins papers right here at the FDR library, I mean, they're replete with this stuff. It's perfectly clear that he saw the Soviet Union as kind of a holy cause that he would support in any way he could.
We don't have too much time left, but I wanted to ask you, over the course of your research, what was the most surprising discovery that you came across?
Well, it's a great question. There's so many. I think one of the more surprising ones, simply because I didn't have any way of expecting it, was actually in the Bulgarian archives, where I found the transcript of a conversation between Hitler and the Bulgarian minister in Berlin in early December 1940, which is eerily close to the time we now know when Hitler made the final decision to go ahead with Barbarossa. What was so interesting about this was both that it was kind of Hitler to some extent off the record, because I don't think he knew that his remarks were being transcribed, and also that, to my knowledge, no other historian has found these remarks. But they show Hitler, he wasn't completely unhinged, but they show his reaction to Stalin's blackmail. That is Stalin saying, we will not join your tripartite pact unless you withdraw all your troops from Romania, Finland, you let us invade Bulgaria and the Turkish Straits. And Hitler just unloaded. I mean, this is the moment when he had had enough. Yes, there were other reasons. He had long been contemplating a war of conquest in the East, but I think that was the moment when he made it up, when he got Stalin's, basically his kind of, it was actually even handwritten on like a napkin, these terms, Stalin's basically refusal, or his kind of almost blackmail. That was the thing I was the most surprised to discover, simply because I'm not sure anyone had ever seen it before.
Well, thank you, Sean, for joining us to discuss your impressive new history of World War II. It's been a true pleasure. And thank you to our audience members for your insightful questions. For more information about upcoming events, please check our website. It's www.victimsofcommunism.org. This concludes the webinar. Thank you all again so much for attending.